Don't you just love those people that give candles as gifts? Or even better, those people that hand you gift cards to a candle shop? I've only ever bought a candle like once in my entire life, and it was from like Walmart and it was on sale. So I wish I could re-gift it, but then I would be the douchebag that's giving candles as presents. I don't know. Anyways, all jokes aside, guys, in today's video, I actually wanted to go through something that kind of popped up on my radar a few months ago. I believe it was during one of the summer conventions, if I'm not mistaken. It was SDCC, maybe, I don't remember, but McFarland decided to showcase his new little line from the DC universe. There were these tiny little Todd mods, 4.5 pre-posed little mini statues, if you will. They don't have any articulation, any joints, and at the time they were pretty interesting. I kind of remember maybe writing something down in my notes, but I completely forgot about them, and they only recently popped back into my recent memory because I believe I saw some pre-orders pop up for them maybe like maybe like a month ago. They're supposed to retail for $14.99. However, I have seen some retailers trying to pawn them off at $20, so just be weary. Depends on where you're buying them from, I suppose, but overall, yes, they're supposed to retail for $14.99. The first little wave that we're getting, all of them at that 4.5-inch scale mark. I don't think that they're scaling these figures at all. They're all going to be the exact same size. You're getting Batman, you're getting a Bane, and you're getting a Swamp Thing. Now, I did see some reviews or some unboxings for some of these figures, and I have to say they look genuinely interesting. They're beefy, they're bulky, they definitely grab your attention. And the Batman, I will say, looks a lot like the Dark Knight version. Same thing with Bane. And then you have Swamp Thing, who looks like obviously some of his most iconic comic book appearances, but it's not really based on any one particular source material. Todd is just taking the idea and kind of just going with it. To me personally, when I first saw this, I was not really excited. I was kind of impressed, but the more and more time that I've had to just sit here and kind of dissect what's going on and this entire little subline from the DC universe, I have to say I'm kind of, I don't know, maybe a little bit disappointed. I would say even more frustrated than anything, because honestly, I've been looking at some of the offerings from the DC Multiverse and the Collector's Edition line and just spawned like some of the Spawn figures or some of his video game franchises, essentially anything that's articulated within that 7-inch mark or 7-inch scale. And I've just been massively disappointed. Not to say that they're like the worst figures ever, or that there aren't some absolute bangers here and there, like every maybe 6 or 7 figure is an absolute must-have, but for the most part, it's figures that you can skip on. Like, are you really going to jump in on the whole Adam West live action show from back in the day? I mean, if they were promising to give us more figures, maybe, but just for an Adam West or just a Reeves figure, I guess if you're a completionist or if you're a big McFarlane fan, you'll pick these up, and they look really well done and really well crafted. But that just means that you have to create another little pocket in your display, and that's just not what I'm about. Like, I would much rather prefer them to continue to flesh out some of the displays or some of the waves that they've already released. Like, I'm still waiting on the Dark Knight Returns mutants or the mutant leader, for example, or just continue to give us different versions of like Superman, maybe like a battle damaged Superman. I know we're getting a battle damaged Batman in that blue variant, blue and gray variant. I haven't seen it in person, but I have seen it go up live online. And the list goes on. I mean, I also want to continue fleshing out my Last Night on Earth display, which at the moment is just one wave. It was like one of his first few waves. Same thing with the DC Metals. I mean, I kind of gave up on that particular universe, but there are people still trying to complete that. There are a lot of these little displays or a lot of these little waves that I think could definitely benefit from a major expansion. And so to see him working on this small little line out of nowhere, I don't know. Like I said, he can do whatever he wants. He's, you know, the big dog. I'm just a tiny little content creator. But I would personally love to see those resources used towards his 7-inch line, because I definitely feel like that's where the money is. That's where most of his profit is coming from. And for him to kind of neglect that community base just to go in and make a cheap little collectible like this. And let's be brutally honest, if we're comparing the two, this is probably a very, very cheap collectible to manufacture. There's no pins to deal with. There's no articulation. The engineering is essentially just create a body mold and then move on. I'm almost guaranteeing everybody here that's watching this video that he'll eventually have like a store exclusive variant that's like black and white or a glow in the dark version, which I think is already kind of buffoonery community, but let's clear the air here. I don't think the line itself is bad. I just feel like the fact that he's deciding to release this right now, where it seems like all of my Targets and Walmarts where the McFarland section is, they're barren, or they're just loaded with just absolute peg warmers that nobody wants. Is that really what your main objective should be, or your priority, to start making new lines? Let's not forget, the Page Punchers 4-inch line to me has been an absolute miss. It's been so disappointing. I never picked up any of these figures, but I do remember that seeing them on clearance and then eventually like at Ross stores. I saw them for as low as $350 if I'm not mistaken, and it wasn't just like a couple per store or anything like that. Like, I remember seeing stacks and stacks of these, whether it was the Flash Rebirth comic book, whether I believe it was the Flashpoint, whether it was Black Adam, whether it was the Batman. I believe they even had a Joker 4-inch action figure with the comic book. I believe these were retailing for $10. Eventually, I think most people picked them up at $5 or even less. Like, I remember seeing them for $350 for the longest period of time, and even then they didn't necessarily move too quickly. And I can almost guarantee if I go to my local Ross, I'm gonna have at least find a handful of these, which is crazy because, like I said, this happened maybe a year ago when I first started seeing these Page Punchers. And I feel like that's what happens when you try to please everybody. The fact that McFarland is trying to kind of find every single little niche or every single little group within the community, I think is a really bad look. I mean, first, he should always worry about his hardcore collectors, people that have always supported his DC Multiverse line or his Spawn universe. Those are the people that he should always be appealing to, and then worry about potentially expanding your community or your fan base or your customer base, because I do feel like there's an audience for this particular type of collectible. There are a lot of people that love smaller action figures like this. Maybe they just don't have the space for it, or maybe they don't want to pay too much out of pocket. $15 is a perfect price point for these figures. As I mentioned, there are people that have smaller budgets but still want to collect some sort of, figurine or something to represent their love for like the DC universe, and maybe this is absolutely perfect for them. But it just makes no sense to me, especially since there's been a long period of time where they've either released very lackluster action figures, or there haven't been that many new releases. Like, there aren't that many new pre-orders hitting stores or hitting people's mailboxes. And look, I'm all for tiny little sublines from McFarland from time to time. Even though I don't agree with the Page Punchers, I don't feel that anybody really wants a tiny little semi-articulated 4-inch action figure. Now, I like the idea of including a comic book in there, but there are a lot of people within the action figure community that could care less about comic books. I think most people just picked this up because it probably looked decent on their wall, and most of them were just gonna wait for them to hit the sales sections anyways. And it wasn't just the DC Page Punchers. He did do some for Spawn. He made some for, I believe, G.I. Joes and Transformers recently, and same thing, they're just not flying off the shelves. People are not interested in these small little semi-articulated figures, and I'm not sure exactly what fan base he's necessarily appealing to here. Not that many kids are interested in the small little 4-inch action figure, and even if they are, I don't think there's a lot of value in the comic book for them. So it's kind of hitting no man's land. Maybe if there's people that are, really into retro action figures and they remember those figures from back in the day that had like 5 points of articulation. I know the Toy Biz action figure line, or the Toy Biz Marvel Legends action figure line, also had some waves that included comic books, which was pretty cool, and some of those have gone up in value recently. Not to mention, there are still a ton of figures that we haven't received from the DC Multiverse in general. Like, yeah, we have received like 3 different versions of Darkseid, but it's not like the classic rendition that we all desperately need. We still don't have a Poison Ivy. We still don't have a proper Harley Quinn. I know McFarland hates female characters, but are we really going to get the Todd Mods action figures, or the first wave for them, before we get some of the most iconic female characters in the DC universe? And just to pour salt on the wound, we actually got a Punchline before we got a proper Harley Quinn. You heard that correctly, Punchline, who is a character that just made her debut like maybe 3 years ago, and we still don't have some of the more classic female characters. We also don't have a proper Two-Face. I think we've had like some movie versions, but never like a classic first appearance comic book or a Rebirth style Two-Face. Heck, at this point, I would have much rather seen a comic book accurate Alfred than this particular little line from McFarland. And yes, there are other OMs that have taken this route to an extent. For example, we do have Hasbro doing the retro line for the Star Wars universe, as well as the Star Wars vintage, as well as the Black Series line, but they've always found a decent amount of balance there. And by the way, both the Black Series and Star Wars vintage line actually have a ton of value. Like, the sculpt work is there. Even for the Star Wars vintage line, there's a decent amount of articulation. You can get those figures into some pretty crazy dynamic poses, even though they're at that 1/18th scale. So they find a way to give a little bit of love to all of their lines. The retro line is also getting some like 4-packs here and there, or some store exclusive variants. The Star Wars vintage line is always getting some new characters, or at least getting some store exclusives. We just got like the Boba Fett, for example, that had some Target exclusive variants, and the list goes on and on. They find a way to give the consumers everything that they need, and in some cases even more. Like, you actually have to pick and choose at times, and I don't feel like McFarlane is doing that enough. I feel like a bulk of their community is waiting on like their 7-inch line, whether it's the video games, whether it's like the live action show stuff, or the Spawn universe at that 7-inch line. Same thing with the DC multiverse, even the DC Direct stuff, which has been selling extremely well for him. The collector's edition line, the DC multiverse, I mean, I feel like this is where most of McFarlane's fan base resides. And so for him to kind of not necessarily turn his back on them, but to kind of focus in on trying to gather more consumers, I think is a little bit of an insult to those hardcore collectors that are just desperately wanting a little bit more for their displays. And I feel like it's not the end of the world. It's not the biggest issue, but I definitely feel as if this is intentionally just for the profits. This is just about making the cheapest collectible that can be resold for quite a bit of profit. I mean, if you look at this collectible, they're probably shipping it from overseas at like $1.50 each. As I said earlier, there's no articulation, there's no joints, there's no pin technology that they have to deal with. The engineering, as I said, is just create the body mold, throw the plastic resin in there, and then just, you know, manufacture them or mass produce them for the consumer. And I feel like he may just be taking the easy way out, and it reeks of like desperation just for profit. And I just don't necessarily love that look for McFarlane. And as I said at the beginning, this is just my personal opinion, my personal take, and I'm definitely blowing things completely out of proportion here. I mean, he can make whatever subline he wants, and this is just a perfect example of him trying to maximize his full potential with the DC license. But I just feel slighted. I'm ready for more DC Multiverse and Collector's Edition line, and it feels like he's utilizing those resources for other just buffoonery like this. But as I said, just my personal opinion. Let me know your thoughts down below. As always, make sure to stay safe out there and enjoy the hobby. Pose your action figures, play with them, whatever your heart desires. It's up to you. Thank you for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one.